Today is February 4th, 2014. My name is Elissa Kaplan, representing the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. I have the pleasure today of interviewing Arnold Yelin for the Veterans Project for the Library of Congress. Good morning, Arnold.
Good morning, good morning.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where and when were you born?
I'm an actual native of Stamford, Connecticut. I was born in Stamford, raised in Stamford, and I'm going to be here for hopefully a few more years.
That's terrific. We don't have a lot of native Stanford people, so we're glad to have you. Tell us a little bit about your parents.
My mother's name was Alice. My father's name was Herbert. They came out of Westchester County where they met and were married in 1925.
What brought them to Stanford?
Probably a combination of business. My father started working up here. I think he was working at a corner store called Schulte's at the time, which was located on the corner of Atlantic and Main Street, at the corner of the Gurley Building. And so they met somehow through a Jewish organization in Stamford. They were introduced. And long story short, here I am.
Wow. What Jewish organization was that? Do you know?
That I'm not clear with. But my mother at the time, before she was married, was living in Yonkers. And we also had other family that had settled in Yonkers, including great-grandfather who had a butcher shop in Yonkers. He immigrated out of Poland. I might be getting a little ahead of myself here.
Right, exactly. So it sounds like your parents had the original J date.
Yeah.
Do you tell us about your siblings? Do you have siblings?
I had two siblings who had passed on. One, her name was Phyllis, and she developed a strep infection when she was 9 years old.
Oh my.
And at the time I was about going on 5, and her doctor, Dr. Nemoitin, at the time, Jake Nemoitin, this was just before they invented the antibiotic sulfanilamide, which would have probably saved her. But it happened very simply. She was going down the hill on a little rag and she scraped her arm and it developed into a strep infection. And at that time, I was being prepared for school, starting kindergarten, and my big sister Phyllis was going to bring me and help me at starting at school. And all of a sudden I didn't have a sister Phyllis. But we still have remembrances of her. I have a second sister, Geraldine, who was born in 1937. She was a blessing to my parents, being a daughter again. And she also had a premature death by cancer when in 1978, and she was only 41. But she had a family at the time, and I have a nephew and a niece by her, and still have my brother-in-law who lives in Florida.
Wow. So your family has been through some hard times.
Yeah.
The purpose of this interview is to find out about your military service. So, how did you happen to serve in the military?
I was drafted during the Korean conflict. I was 22 at the time. I had graduated high school in 1948, Stanford High School. And at that time, a lot of young men that weren't in college at the time were being drafted into the service. If you were in college, I think you could apply for a deferment. And but I was working in my father's business in photography at the time, so I was available for the draft, and I was consequently drafted. And that was March of 1952.
So how did you get a letter telling you?
Yes,
you were aboard,
they
or-
had the draft board located in Stamford, and you got, first of all, notification, you had to register for the draft.
And you did that, how old were you when you had to
And I think you
register?
had to register when you're about right after 18, right after high school. I think everybody was obligated to register. And I'm not sure what the age limit was, but I think it was, you could have been registering people that were in their 40s.
Oh, wow.
Could have been registering for the draft. And that goes back to the Second World War, when they had to have a larger group to choose from. And but in Korea, it was, I think, mainly for younger people coming out of high school. And I'm not sure what the age limit that you had to, I think it was between 18 and 25 you had to register.
So you were drafted into the Army?
I was drafted into the Army, right. At that time, we didn't know, because at that period of time, when you were drafted and you were, went into up to the induction center, which was in New Haven. And that's where you were sworn in. And at that time, evidently because of losses the Marine Corps had, or not enough numbers in the Marine Corps, they were doing drafting into the Marines too. So you didn't know until the end of the day whether you were going to be going into the Army or going into the Marines.
Now, were you worried about that?
Of course, everybody was sort of, had their antennas up. And I had close friends that went in with, and it was inducted with, that was chosen for the Marines that day.
Right. It's the Marines who get out first, right? Ooh.
That's right,
And the Army just takes them there.
right.
Okay, so you got into the Army. What happened next?
Okay, we went to, from Stanford, we went to, by train, to New Haven, to the induction center. And we spent most of the day up there getting an initial physical, being sworn in, various other or induction services you had to do. And then you might have had an interview. That's when it was decided whether you were going into the Marines or the Army. Because your name was called and you went up before this Navy chief, who was there to people that were going into the Marines. Because at the time, supposedly, if you were going into the Marines, you had to have a clean record, no police records or anything like that.
Right.
And if there's any question come up, you were turned down and you went into the Army. I was not even sent in for an interview, but I do have a little story about one young man that was interviewed by the chief, and he was trying to get out of the Marines. So when the chief says, "Do you have a police record?" He said, "Yes," thinking that he would get out of the Marines. And the chief looked up and he says, "What was it for?" He says, "Carrying a concealed weapon." He says, "Good, we'll show you how to use it. You're in."
Oh, so it backfired.
Oh, backfire.
Okay, now, you spent the day in New Haven. Did you go home? Or?
No, from there, you were in the service at that time, being
wow.
sworn in. From there, we were put on buses and transported up to Fort Devens in Massachusetts, in Air, Mass, which is an induction center. At that time, they went through records, did interviews, personal interviews. You were there for anywhere from a week or two. And when they decided where you were going to be shipped for basic training, then they shipped you out of Fort Devens to that basic training site. I was there for almost 2 weeks, because I was shipped down to Augusta, Georgia, where I did my basic training at Fort Gordon, Georgia. I was there. I was at that time sort of pre-assigned to the Signal Corps because it was a Signal Corps basic training. Signal Corps basic training opposed to normal infantry basic training is about half the time. It's an 8-week basic training course instead of 16 weeks you might get at an infantry basic training.
Now, did you have a test so that you could get into the Signal Corps, or?
Yes. Well, it wasn't a test. It was referral recommendations. You heard stories probably of an engineer being made a cook in the service or something like that.
Right.
Well, I was lucked out because I did journalistic photography, some for the Stanford Advocate before I left, some for the Stanford Shopper before I left, and I got letters from the editor of the Stanford Advocate stating of what I did for them and how I could be best used by the service as a photographer. So I was evidently, as part of my interviews up at Fort Devens, they saw these letters, and they at that time said, well, maybe he could be a photographer for the service. So that's how I ended up with basic training at a Signal Corps basic.
Right.
Now that was for 8 weeks.
Now, had you ever been in the South before?
Only trips to Miami.
And not through Augusta?
Not to Augusta, no, not that part of the South I was introduced to.
So you left in the spring when it might have been a snowy day, and you arrived in warmer weather, I bet.
April 7th, I believe, was the day I got to Augusta. They flew us down from Boston to Augusta.
And what was it like being in a southern base? Of course, you were in basic training, but what was it like?
Well, you were in a group of maybe 70 or 80 other trainees that we flew down with, and they put us on a bus and shipped us to the barracks, and they read us a riot act and what we could do, couldn't do. We met our sergeant, and you go through all the training, which is, a lot of it is discipline training as well as actual marching and learning how to fire a rifle, etc.
Right, and physical training as well.
And physical training also. Thank God at that time I was in fairly good physical shape.
Now, Harry Truman had already integrated the armed forces. Did you have a diverse population? Did you have black soldiers?
Oh yes,
with you?
we had. It was very well mixed. And the president at the time I was inducted was Eisenhower. And we had a very diverse group. There was no segregation or anything, especially being on an Army base. You might have stepped outside of the Army base and found a different situation, but not in the service.
Did you go into town at all? Were you allowed to?
Yes, as a matter of fact, my mom and dad set up a little account with me at a local hotel so that if I could get a weekend leave from basic training, I could spend it at this hotel for a couple of days and relax and enjoy it.
Did you get to see the masters while you were there? You were there for the right time
of year? That was where it is, but I was probably right in the middle of basic training when the masters was going on. Well, halfway through basic training, I developed a bronchitis infection. I was in the hospital down there for about 10 days to 2 weeks, and because of that, I had to, what they call, wash back into the next basic training group and start all over again. So I was actually, instead of 8 weeks, I was down there for a total of 16.
You got to do it twice.
I got to do it twice. Lucky me.
Now, it was a diverse population of people. Did people know you were Jewish? Did you encounter any kind of anti-Semitism?
I did not encounter any type of anti-Semitism there. I guess everybody else had more on their mind than worrying about what somebody else was. And we were just one group trying to help each other get through basic training.
Right, right. Did the local Jewish community show up at all?
No, I don't know how much of a Jewish community at the time there was in Augusta. And I didn't seek it out at the time. I had more on my mind than that.
You were getting ready to go to a war.
And that's probably did it. There was a big question mark. Where was I going to end up? Nobody knew until you got there. I did know that I was going to be shipping out of Georgia eventually and going up to Fort Monmouth because I had to complete the rest of my basic training for photography, which was at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. Now,
How did you get there?
by train. After our 8 weeks, we were assigned by train. We put on a train, an overnight train, out of Augusta, which we ended up in Newark.
Now, were all the people you were with doing the same job? They're all photography people?
Not all photography, no. There were different types of radio people, wire people, different people. Some of the extended basic training they had right there at Fort Gordon, but some of the specialized training you had to go up to Fort Monmouth.
What division were you assigned to, or you?
It was still a training division,
Still training.
and it was considered basic training. Now, at the time, I had already met my wife. We had been going out together. In fact, we were going out together since we were about 16, I guess it was. We met at the Jewish Center in Stanford. And she had gone into nursing training. And when I went into the service, I was up at Fort Devens, and she came up with my parents and my sister at the time to visit me on a weekend at Fort Devens. And we decided at that time that we were going to get married.
Oh, my.
Okay? Now, making plans to get married when you're in the service, especially basic training, is not something that's easily done. When we got up to, when I was down in Georgia, we had said I should be through basic training in the middle of July, and we planned on a wedding date, which was not a big wedding. It was just in the rabbi's chapel study. And we planned it for the end of August, August 23rd. And when I got up to Fort Monmouth, a little bit of a side story there is, when you're in basic training, it's against the rules of basic training to get personal leave time.
Right.
When you get to a new base, you get an orientation booklet explaining about things that the base offers, what your rights are, what you can do, can't do. And in the book that was given to me when I arrived at Fort Monmouth was a reason for an emergency furlough. Now, right there in the book, it said reason for emergency furlough. One of the reasons was marriage. They didn't say what kind of a marriage. But I picked them up on this, and it went right to the commanding general at the basic training in Fort Monmouth. He applied for an emergency furlough. He says, well, you're not supposed to get one in basic training. And he says, well, in the book here, and he showed him the book, it says reason for emergency furlough would be marriage, and he's being married. I got a 10-day furlough.
Wow.
And after the furlough, which we went on a little honeymoon up to Niagara Falls, and we were away for about a week, 10 days, and then I was back to Fort Monmouth for the rest of my training there.
Oh, my. From paradise to the other end. Do you
Right.
do you remember the name of the commander of Fort Monmouth? The
No.
commanding general? No. Okay. He was a one-shot deal. Okay. Wow. So you're now you're married.
Now I'm married. My wife moved down to, we got housing off base at Red Bank, New Jersey, which is about 4 or 5 miles from the base.
Did you
and-
have a car? Did you own a car?
And I had a car, right?
What kind of car was
It was a Plymouth. It was a Plymouth. And it was blue Plymouth,
Not black.
not black. And we set up a little apartment there. My wife at that time had graduated nursing, and she got a job working at Red Bank Hospital in New Jersey, off base. So she did her thing during the day, and I was away. And unless I had duty, special duty at night, I was back home after 5, you know. But we were there for about 4 months. And at the end of my training period there, I got orders to be shipped over to the Far East.
Oh my.
Now that was right during Korea, and when you were shipped over to the Far East, the majority of the individuals shipped over were going to Korea. But the fact is, part of the Far East was Japan, I believe anywhere in the Pacific area, so you could have been assigned. And when I got to, we shipped over by ship out of Seattle, Washington.
Oh, Seattle.
Right, we were, my port of embarkation was Seattle. I had a report, and I reported out there by train, as a matter of fact. I took a train from the East Coast to the West Coast to Seattle, and I was there for about 15 days when we were completely processed and assigned to a boat. We were by bus down to the pier in Seattle and boarded. At that time, the ship that I shipped over on was the SS Walker. And it was not only for the troops, but it also carried dependents. So any dependents that were going to go over and live in the area, dependents, they couldn't go to Korea and live,
Right.
but they could take up housing in Japan.
Did some people go to the Philippines as well?
Philippines was Okinawa. There are all bases in the General Far East Command.
So there were wives and children aboard
There were
on your
wives
ship?
and children, yes. Yeah. And the ship took us over. It took about 2 weeks. We part of our shipping was going through a typhoon at the time, and so we had quite a few upset stomachs. But we did get there. It took about 15 days, as I said. We arrived at the port in Yokohama, and it's U.S. Army port in Yokohama. And after we got everybody off of the ship, the ones that were going to be separated or dispersed into various parts of the Far East, were sent by train to Tokyo, which is about 18, 20 miles by train. And the train went right to the Camp Drake Center, which is a disbursement center for all the personnel. When you arrived at Camp Drake, you had a processing center there. The first place you went was to a general area where you were able to send a telegram home letting everybody know that you arrived safely. And then you had other meetings that you had to attend, and one of the meetings that you attended, they gave you your orders at that time, and they called your name out.
So you were in a large group?
In a large group, right. They called your name out, and they told you local orders or Korea orders. I didn't realize that I was supposed to meet that assembly at the time. So after I sent my telegram home, myself and another fellow went back to our barracks and found that nobody else was in the barracks. And when all of a sudden, about a half hour later, this whole group of inductees, soldiers, came back in with their M1 rifles on their shoulders, most of them, because they got Korea orders. And they were given their rifles right in Japan,
Oh, wow.
which became a part of their body. So when I went up to the sergeant, I said, we made a mistake. We missed this assembly. We didn't get our orders. He says, well, it's no problem, just go back to the next one, go back to the center, and they'll read your name off as they read off others that might have missed the meeting there. And when I went back with this other GI there, his name was called before mine. He says, Korea. And I was ready. But when my name was called, they said local.
Wow.
Local could have meant anywhere. But again, to make a long story short, after spending about 2 weeks at Camp Drake, doing much of nothing, I was assigned to the photography 71st Signal Service Division, which was based right in Tokyo. So that was about an 18-mile bus trip out of Camp Drake. So one Saturday, they put me on a bus, and we stopped at various different divisions, an engineering division, it could have been another service division, and then when he got to the signal division, that's where I was dropped off. It turned out I was billeted in what was at the time of the Second World War, like the West Point of Japan. It was called, developed the Western name of Hardy Barracks, which was a 4-story, self-contained barracks. When I say self-contained, it had everything from billeted rooms for the personnel, to movie theaters, to service clubs, to all kinds of showers, any kind of services you would need right within that oval 4-story building. And that's where we were billeted. I was billeted for the next 15, 16 months.
Oh.
My workstation, which is about a 10, 15-minute bus ride from the billet to the center of Tokyo. And the office that I was billeted in was catty-corner to the palace grounds. So we were very, very, very much centered right in the center of Tokyo.
What were your impressions of Tokyo, of Japan? I mean, and you were an American coming to
Right.
Japan right after World War II.
You had some, you still had some animosities toward the GI, toward the Americans. They took one heck of a beating over there. But there was also a lot of these feelings that were forgotten, mainly because they depended on the Americans for their livelihoods. A lot of them worked for the U.S. government as either chauffeurs driving GIs where they wanted to be, or in my case, in the dark rooms of the laboratories, they had Japanese personnel who in their own right were photographers or lab technicians. So they were taking advantage of the local personnel for what they were, for their, what their, I almost use MOS. MOS was a category there you were assigned to a number for the profession you were in. So that any time you would find some women that would walk down the street Western garb, and you'd find a lot of the Japanese still in their traditional kimonos, everyday dress. It was very interesting, I would say. Tokyo and Japan at that time was in the middle of getting westernized, really westernized, post-war westernized. Consequently, they had some modern hotels in the city at that time. Now, mind you, this was still maybe 7, 8 years after the war ended, Second World War. So they had a little bit of adjusting to get ready, and they were adjusting. Tokyo became a very, very westernized city, very modern westernized city. But you didn't have to go too far outside of Tokyo to meet the traditional Japanese.
Tell us a little bit about the language and the food and
Language, you got to know enough Japanese to get you by, and they had to know enough English to make a living by it. So if they were able to speak the language and understand the language to some degree, they were able to make a better living from the GIs. And if we got into a cab and wanted to get there fast, we learned to use the word hayako, which was fast. And then that cab would take off. So we learned some Japanese also, and some little, and you were just enough to get by with, which I still remember a few words, but not that much.
And did you eat out or eat traditional foods or?
We could eat out, but we didn't. We didn't that much. If you wanted to get real curious about something and try out a Japanese restaurant, you could do that. Enough around, and you were always welcome there. But we had full Western meals at our barracks, which is a complete dining room service with our own barracks. Or at service clubs around town, which were GI oriented because they're for the use of the service personnel. Number one, that were stationed there. Number two, that were coming in from R&R from Tokyo. They spend 3 or 4 days there, going, visiting, doing different things on their rest vacations. And one of the things is a big service club we had in Tokyo, which had everything from bingos to all kinds of services, barbershops, bars. So the name of that club was known by probably anybody that was assigned to the Far East Command. It was called the Rocker 4 Club. And
famous.
Famous, right. And of course they also had PXs in various parts of town. And next to the PX in central Tokyo was a local dentist. So if you had any dental work that had to be done, you could go and have it done there. You had all the services, all the facilities that you would have.
And did you have any religious facilities as a
Yes. As a matter of fact, I had another Jewish fellow that was on bunk right next in the same room as me. And when it came time for the fall and Rosh Hashanah, we did find out that they had a Jewish center and a temple, and they had Jewish services. And I went to Jewish services at this Japanese service in just outside of Tokyo Center. It was about 2 miles from where we were stationed.
So the Jews there were Japanese Jews?
Japanese Jews. And there's a very funny story. I met another gentleman that came over. He was assigned from Stanford. He was a husband of a family that we had known that was shipped over in Japan. He was an officer. And he told me a story of when he went shopping, when he was coming in on R&R. And he used to shop for things to send back home, little trinkets or whatever. And he went into this Japanese shop, and they carried everything in the shop. And the whole thing is, you would never let a Japanese shop get away with giving you a price. You always had to dicker with them, back and forth, back and forth. And the last thing this guy did when he was shopping for it, he says, "No, I'm not going to pay that price." And he went around, turned around to walk out, and the shopkeeper cursed him in Yiddish. Okay? This stunned him to a standstill right then and there. And he turned around, and the last night they were friends ever since. So you had your Japanese Jewish contingent that were businessmen in Japan, the same as the businessmen here. But those are funny things that remember. Now that happened 50 years ago. This is one of the funnier things that I remember happening when I was here anyway.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's get back to your job.
Yeah.
Tell us what you did, what your photography was like.
I was lucky enough to be able to do this photography because when you were a photographer in the service, you had rights to do anything, go anywhere. The commanding general when I was in Japan was Mark Clark. The first thing that I got when I was assigned to my photography unit was a card, identification card, and it was signed by Mark Clark. And I was given authority to take pictures anywhere I was assigned to take pictures. And nobody could question it.
The ultimate press pass.
Right, the ultimate press pass. Anytime I went out on an assignment, I had an assignment sheet with me. And on the back of the sheet, it says anybody that is interfering with this photographer doing his job has to report to my office. Signed by Mark Clark. So nobody got in your way. We had free passage to within the job we were doing to go anywhere and do it the way we were supposed to do it. We had, of course, credentials on our arm, patches, who we were, photographers, we were identified. And nobody interfered with us. Consequently, I always said, although I ended up with 2 stripes on my arm, it was like having a star on your shoulder.
Right. You had your own Jeep and driver and all that?
We were assigned to, we didn't have our own Jeep, but anytime we went out on a job, we were given papers to pick up our transportation, which could have been either a Jeep or actually a sedan to go wherever we were going.
Tell us about a typical assignment. Do you have a good story about one?
Well, we did different things from where there was awards service, where there was an award ceremony going on. Someone was receiving a medal for something, and they had the marching out of the honor guard, and officers came and called the individual, and we were taking pictures of everything happening because those pictures would not only go back to Stars and Stripes or other hometown releases for that individual that was receiving the honor. That was one thing that we might have been doing. We might have been going to a hospital where Mrs. Clark, Mark Clark's wife, used to go regularly to visit wounded patients that had been transported back to Tokyo Army Hospital. And she would visit the patients. We would take pictures of her visiting with the patients, and those pictures in turn would go back to that individual's hometown for publication and to the parents of that GI. We might have other assignments. It could have been anything, to a retirement party from a commanding general, to a party that was, how should I say, without reason, that they just wanted a photographer there to take pictures, which was off the record, of course.
Absolutely.
We had, there was one assignment where the 82nd Airborne was going to be doing a practice jump. They were assigned to, their base was down not too far from Mount Fuji, and they were going to be doing a practice jump, and at the time things were just very, very slow. There wasn't much going on in the photography section, and we were getting very bored, and I got the idea of what would it be like to go down as a photographer, cover that jump, and doing it from the top down. And I brought the idea before my commanding officer who was a captain. And very bluntly, he said, "Are you crazy?" And he says, "Have you ever had any jump experience?" I said, "No, but, everything is connected. You go, and in the meantime, when I get out, I would just take pictures, what it's like." He said, "No way." And now I think about how crazy I really must have been and how bored I must have been. But I did have very interesting experiences. I had the opportunity of meeting many movie personnel, Mickey Rooney, Earl Holliman, Ray Milland, that happened to be there doing movies, scenes. One movie they're working on was the Bridget Stokery, but they did nightclub scene, other scenes in Tokyo. And I was assigned to go and take hometown release pictures there because they were using GIs in the movies. And they took some of the pictures that the GIs were in these scenes and again using them for hometown release, sending them home to the local newspapers saying, "Look who's going to be in this movie," or whatever. And other personalities, when Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio were married, they went over to Japan on their honeymoon with their chaperone, who was Lefty O'Doul, who was another famous ball player. And I don't know if you remember, Will, you might not remember, but I had got an assignment. I rigged an assignment as it was because there was no official assignment. And I had an assignment made official to meet the airport, meet the plane that came in with them on it, and take pictures, which I took good pictures. I took pictures of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio and everybody else is arriving. And these pictures were presented to her about a couple of days after and said, "If you will go over and visit the troops for a day or two in Korea, we'll make a general distribution through State Department of all these pictures and give you free publicity." And of course, Joe didn't want to have any part of it. He was a very low-key type of individual, and she couldn't turn it down. So consequently, I have pictures of her from coming out of her airplane. They had to get her out of a plane. Now this is the old double-deck strata cruisers, I think they called them at the time. And there was such a crowd of fans around that airplane, the steps leading from the airplane, that they couldn't get them off the plane through the steps. There were Japanese photographers, because there were Japanese are very baseball conscious also, and they were very, very much Marilyn Monroe fans. That's Marilyn Monroe. And when the photographers from Japan went out on an assignment, they had three. They had the reporter, they had the photographer, and they had someone carrying a stepladder to get them over the Caucasians, photographers, so they could get their pictures. So they're all waiting around the steps for her to come out, and I said, "There's no way they're going to get her out of the plane this way." So I went around the back of the plane, and they brought her out of the escape hatch at the bottom of the plane. And she stepped into a Jeep, and I have a picture of her getting into the Jeep that way, and they whisked her off.
Was she as beautiful as the pictures?
She was. Following that up, I followed her back to the hotel, and I got pictures of her in her room. First thing she got was a massage from a Japanese masseuse, and we're talking things. And then I got a call from my commanding officer. He says, "The Army made a deal with her. We're going to be taking pictures. She's going to be going over to Korea. We have to get a picture for her Geneva Convention card." Now, Geneva Convention card is anybody that's in an active area has to have it. In case of capture or anything of that type, she has to be covered by the Geneva Convention. Now, on the card, part of that card was a picture. I had to get a picture of her, so it was assigned. She went over to, at the Tokyo Army Hospital, they had a hairdresser salon. So she was going to have her her hair done there, and after her hair done, she was being brought into the commanding officer, colonel's office, to have her picture taken for a Geneva Convention card. So I met her there, and I was talking with her, as I'm talking to you right now for a while, because I hadn't been home for about a year.
Wow.
What's going on at home? What's new? Oh, this is happening, that's happening. You know, that's very casual conversation. Funny story, if I have time, is when she came in for her picture, she was wearing a very low V-neck.
Lucky you.
Yeah. And she was a kid. In talking to her, we're back and forth, and all this hometown information, what's going on back in the States and everything else. And at the time, I don't know if you remember, women used to use fake moles. They used to paste them in various parts of
I remember.
Marilyn Monroe had twin moles right on the inside of each bosom with her low, and it was, now mind you, I apologize. Nothing was said until I got home about a year later, and I was sitting at the Palace Theater watching a movie with Marilyn Monroe, and she comes out in an evening gown, and all of a sudden noticing two twin moles and blurring out in the middle of the theater. My God, they're real. And people were looking at me. Then, in fact, I had to explain to Barbara what I meant.
Oh my. That could have really gotten you in trouble.
Right. When we got back out of the service, jumping ahead a little bit, Barbara and I took a trip, 15,000-mile trip, road trip around this country for 2 months. And we happened to be up in the state of Washington, in Wenatchee, Washington at the time. And they had a big apple blossom festival at the time going on. And Barbara stopped into a drugstore and picked up a movie magazine, just as something to read during the trip. And there's this whole spread of pictures that I had done of the two of them in the movie magazine.
Well, now, did you get credit for the pictures you took?
U.S. Army photo.
Wow.
But the photographer did get a credit on all the pictures that were taken. So somewhere down the Pentagon, they do have my name attached to the pictures.
We'll go look.
And I have a copy of her Geneva Convention card in a frame at home that was presented to me in another long story from the commanding officer of the ROTC at Westfield High School, who happened to get his hands on this thing, and he said he had it, and I didn't believe him. But the Corps presented me with this in a little frame.
This was back in Stanford when you were
Back in Stanford, right.
So, back in Tokyo, how did you keep in touch with family and friends at home?
Strictly letters, occasionally a phone call. You were able to get a phone call.
Now, were these radio calls?
Yeah, there were telephone calls. There were telephone calls. But you had to make arrangements when you were going to do it. You know, it had to be a prearranged call. And I only made maybe 2 or 3 at the most back home for an anniversary or a birthday or something like that.
Did you get to see your wife at any time? Did you have an R&R? Did you
No.
during that? No, the
No.
whole time
No.
you were saying.
No.
Tell us about leaving Japan and coming home and getting out of the service. How did that work?
Okay, when I left Japan, we left our unit, and again, we reversed backtracked everything. We had to go back to Camp Drake, which was our separation center, and wait for shipping information from there.
Let me just ask you one thing. How did you know you were going home? Was there did you know ahead of time how long you were going to be in Japan?
Yes, you automatically got home because you had to be released within 2 years of the time you went in.
So you knew that it was coming.
Right, unless I signed off for an extension. They tried to get me to extend because at that time, Chinese were just taking over Formosa as the national Chinese Chiang Kai-shek's National Chinese were moving to Formosa, and they wanted a photographer to take pictures of the repatriation. And they asked me if I would go down to Formosa to do that. What it would mean, I'd have to extend. And I would probably have been shot by my wife and family if I did that, so I turned it down. And so then they put me on a ship back home. And we went from back to Camp Drake to the ship in Yokohama, and the ship. And this ship, now, mind you, we're going home. And anybody that's going home after being away for a year and a half, you're anxious to get home. The ship I was put on, again, was a dependent ship. So we're not only GIs going back, but there are also personnel, family, and families. And the first stop the ship did out of Yokohama was we went to Okinawa. So instead of going straight back to the West Coast, we had to stop in Okinawa. And then after we picked up some more dependents in Okinawa, we started heading back toward Hawaii. And of course, now there's, you had to have protection on these ships. They did have a gun on the ship, believe it or not. And the sailors had to take gunnery practice. So in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we had to turn around because where the sun was, and they're taking gunnery practice. And then after the gunning practice, we got a call, the ship got a call that there was a medical emergency, that we had to meet another ship and transfer one of the sailors onto our ship for emergency appendicitis. We had a good hospital unit on our ship. So we were the closest, and of course you have to come to that. Consequently, after about 20 days, we got back to San Francisco with a stop-off between there and in Pearl Harbor. We stopped there to pick up some more dependents, and it took about 4 days from Hawaii to get back to San Francisco. And that lovely Golden Gate Bridge. I'll never forget the rest of my life sailing under the Golden Gate and sailing up to the U.S. Army Pier in San Francisco.
Now, did your wife meet you on the West Coast? Or
No, but she had some fellow nursing students that she went through training with that were at Mount Sinai Hospital in San Francisco. And she got the word that the ship was coming in. The friends came and met me at the pier. So all of a sudden, I was coming down the gangplank of the ship, and the MP that were down there pulled my arm. He says, "Go off to the side here." I said, "Why? What did I do?" And there they were. So I was having a little bit of a meeting me there. And from there, it progressed very fast. We were there for about an hour, and they packed us onto a ferry boat, which went up the bay to an Army base, Camp Stoneham, which was, again, a separation center, which you did a quick physical coming back into the state. You were only there for about 5 or 6 hours.
Oh, that was quick.
And then they put us on buses to Oakland and onto a plane back to Newark. With a one stop in Omaha. We were back in Newark the next day, about dinner time, and my family and wife met me at the airport. I had to, after about an hour, of course, they put us on a bus to Camp Kilmer, which is a separation center in New Jersey. And I got there, and I immediately got a 2-day pass, I believe it was, after we signed in. So my family met me at the camp, and of course Barbara and I spent the weekend in New York at the McAlpin Hotel.
What was the date?
I was out of the service March 23rd.
And
So
the
this
year?
was probably around the late teens, around the 20th that I was
And the year?
of 1954.
So you your home with your wife, whom you'd only been with a short time. How did you readjust to civilian life?
Well, we were home only for a couple of weeks when, if you remember, I mentioned that we took this trip around the country after we got back. And we had arranged, and we left, I think was the end of March, because we were going the April and May. It was about 60 days. And we immediately started driving around the country, and we drove, as I said, 15,000 miles. We headed south, then across to New Orleans, down from Texas into Mexico, up to the West Coast, San Diego,
Wow, what a great
up the
honeymoon.
West Coast. Yeah, we saw an awful lot of this country,
And you took a lot of pictures.
and we took a lot of pictures. Yeah, it was quite an experience. I did get back. I had to get back for June because I had a wedding that I was obligated to take pictures of.
You had a job. Oh my goodness. Did you make any good friends in the army? Do you keep in touch with any? Did you keep in touch?
Notable friends, yes, I did. I had friends, of course, you went through training with, and you were in service with, you had. I no longer have really that many at this point. But notable friends that I did, well, I was doing a lot of nursing school photography when I came out of the service for the nursing students' yearbook pictures at various hospitals and medical centers in the entire metropolitan area. And I'll never forget one day that I was taking pictures at Lenox Hill Hospital, the nurses, and they wanted to take a class picture in Central Park, which is a couple of blocks over from where their school was. So the class walked over and met over there, right in the area of the Mad Hatter statue, which is in Central Park. And when we got there, there was a movie setup, movie crew. I was doing a movie, some kind of movie short, and who was in the movie but Mickey Rooney? And after we took pictures of the girls' class and everything else, I told the girls, just sit tight just a minute. So after they had a break on the movie crew, I went over to Mickey. I said to Mickey, do you remember the Bridges of Tokary pictures we took at the nightclub scene in Tokyo? He said, like that. Because he saw the camera in my hand. He says, yeah, outside the nightclub. And this was Mickey. He's very, So I said, right. I said, he said, yeah, we took pictures over there. I said, yeah, I'm taking pictures now of the nursing school, the students from the Lenox Hill Hospital here. I said, how about posing for a picture with them for the yearbook? He said, oh, yeah, bring them around, So he got right in the middle of this whole group of pictures, and we took a picture of them. But the fact is, Mickey does have a good memory also. And as I said, I was honored to be able to meet some of these people. Post-service, I also was taking pictures in sports for many years. I did pictures at the baseball writers' dinner. I met Joe DiMaggio there again and reminded of our experience, which he didn't want to be reminded too much of that trip with Marilyn because of her going over to Tokyo, or over to Korea.
Did you keep in touch with anybody, any Japanese people at all?
Not that I met over there, but I did have a very close friend who did a lot of work for Japanese media over here that I knew from pro football that I used to take pictures there. Another Stanfordite that I went into the service was Murray Levine. Murray passed away a few years ago, otherwise known as Bucky. We grew up together. He was stationed in Japan, in Germany though, with his wife. But we went into service at the same time, same day. We got our buddy bags. I don't know if I explained about the buddy bag, but the buddy bag is something, it was a little temporary items that you could use for the first few days you were in the service. And it was handed out by the B'nai B'rith of Stanford, Selma Plotnick.
Oh, my.
She was her job to be down at the train station anytime that the local draftees were leaving town, and to hand all the draftees that were going away these little buddy bags, which had toothbrush, combs, little sundry things to have to use that you might not have available, a shed razor, things of that type. But the B'nai B'rith did this in Stanford during the, I'm not sure when they started to do it. It was during the Second World War, but it did extend through the Korea, I know. And we left 6:30 in the morning, and they were there, every group that left Stanford.
What a lovely, lovely gesture.
Yeah.
What are some of the life lessons you learned from the military, if any?
Well, you learn a lot. You learn a lot. How to be understanding of others. Not only your fellow servicemen, but of other nationalities. I made friends over in Japan, not that I have still that many of, but it made me a little bit of a world traveler, knowing that there's more than what's in your own backyard, and meeting other people from around the country, who when I did get back and made that trip around the country with my wife, we did make stops to see some of the people that I were in the service with. And a big USO individual was a man by the name of Johnny Grant. He was a disc jockey out of Hollywood. He was the mayor of Hollywood, so to speak, and he used to bring all these USO shows over to the Far East to entertain the troops. And I was able to get to see him when I got out of the service on our trip across the country. And he again remembered, and he got us in to see and meet Dennis Day in one of his Dennis Day shows, Dennis Day being a vocalist of years ago. And we were very lucky to meet a lot of people. It was an education, a world education. So I was lucky not to be assigned to a front line. I was lucky that I was assigned to the 71st Signal Battalion after they got back to Tokyo from Korea, where they were pretty well shot up in a military conflict. They were over in Korea taking pictures with cameras and 45s on their hips when the Chinese contingent came over and gave them severe casualties. I was lucky to be a replacement back in Tokyo for that organization. And I was lucky not to be having to been assigned to them earlier, where I might have been at the wrong end of a shooting engagement in Korea earlier.
Wow, what a story. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us that's unique or noteworthy about your experience?
I think I probably missed a few points, but I think you've got pretty much most of it in a nutshell. I still have many, many fond memories, a lot of sad memories.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I thought I had it off. That's